record, and then we'll come out the camera here.
Okay.
Stand by.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Decibel. This is Capitol Coffee Talk. Our issue today, thousands of National Guard members sent to our southern border.
They need to be held accountable.
Rody, happy to be filling in for Judy Maggio, who's taking some time off, and I'm always glad to have Ben Philpott here with us. You know him. He's a regular here from KUT. And our special guest today is Joy Diaz, KUT's Texas Standard.
Yes,
welcome.
Thank you for having me here, Leslie.
You didn't bring your coffee. We'll have to get you some.
I know, I have some water.
Okay, that's even better. Much healthier for you. Thanks for being here. Well, of course, we mentioned our topic today is all of the National Guard troops headed to the border, not just our state, but others. Ben, can you kind of just fill us in on what's the latest, what's happening?
Yeah, I think the latest is that Governor Abbott has announced that the state's going to be sending, I believe it's 300 additional troops a week over the next 3 weeks or so. And that's going to ramp up to 1,000 troops, I believe, on the Texas border. The President Trump, says that he wants 4,000 troops on the Texas border. Kind of the interesting thing in all this is, especially in Texas, how not unusual this is. We've had National Guard troops and State Guard troops at the Texas border multiple times over the last decade, I believe.
Absolutely.
President Obama had people had troops move to the border. So did President Bush. And now, of course, President Trump. I think one thing that's interesting, we have talked a lot on Capitol Coffee Talk about just trying to educate people about things that maybe they don't quite get in terms of how politics works. These troops are not allowed to guard the border. I mean, they're
not law enforcement. Basically.
They're not law enforcement.
Right.
If the country of Mexico were to invade the U.S. and they were down there, yes, they would be able to guard the border, but that's not what's happening.
Absolutely.
So these troops that are going down there are mostly doing surveillance.
Okay.
If they see someone crossing the border, they then call Border Patrol and they say, hey, here's a person we just saw crossing the border. The troops themselves do not go and engage with the people crossing. They're also there, and this is what the governor even said, they're there for support. So maybe they're bringing supplies in or other things that help the Border Patrol, the people that are authorized to do things on the border. United States troops are not allowed to be law enforcement within the United States. There's a legal ruling on that. And so this is, I think you've heard some people say that this is a little bit more show than anything. This is not a force to block the border because they are not legally allowed to do that kind of force.
Well, President, from what I heard, this was ordered because of, at least the White House says, this surge in illegal activity. The reaction to that here in Texas, I mean, is that something that people think is more of a political move, or is that actually something that's happening? Do we know that?
I mean, overall in Texas, immigration and border security has been polled multiple times over the years as the top item. Specifically, when you're looking at Republican voters, it is almost always the number one or number two issue when you poll Republicans. This is data from the University of Texas. And the Texas Tribune, they do a poll about every 6 months, and that has tracked that immigration and border security is absolutely top for Republican voters. And so in a majority Republican state, this is then a move that it appears most voters are fine with.
Joy, you've done a lot of reporting
A lot.
Immigration issues specifically, and I know you're from Mexico City, right?
I am from Mexico City.
What kind of reaction can you give us from either friends you know, people you know still there, or in the southern part of our state?
Well, there's several things going on. One of the things that is happening is that we are having a presidential election in Mexico in the coming months.
Okay.
So one thing that clearly illustrates how important the border is and border issues are between Mexico and the United States is that one of the major candidates, and perhaps one of the most polarizing candidates, and perhaps the person who will be the next president of Mexico, launched his official campaign from the border.
From the border.
So that's how you know that people in Mexico care about the border. But from people who live on the border, on the Texas side, what I hear is, you guys talk about the militarization of the border. What we call that is the saturation of uniformed personnel, right? And what happens when you have a saturation of uniforms is that you don't really know who's in charge, right? And what happens when you don't know who's in charge is that you can have a lot of types of abuse. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that before. We've seen it in communities that were, having lots of speeding tickets, for instance, right? Which is a way of, there's nothing else for these people to do, so what do? They do traffic. Right. Those kinds of things. So there's a lot of worry in some of the communities, but there's also another aspect of this, which is interesting, and I heard this from a couple of people. The aspect of there is going to be an economic bonanza in a way. You have a lot of people coming in, they need places to stay, they're going to eat, they're going to live here. So in a way, there's a benefit to the communities. So it's a lot of mixed feelings.
Yeah, the state of Texas in the last legislative session authorized, I think, another $2 billion for, or up to $2 billion. Maybe it was just $800 million this last time. I'm sorry, I'm getting numbers wrong. But a good bit of money to go towards border security, including things like overtime for DPS people, or moving of DPS people from other parts of the state down there, hiring some new DPS agents. And yeah, that's not a small bit of money flowing into a part of the state.
Absolutely. I know that when I've visited, you can have a 300-room hotel full of uniformed personnel. There's no tourists. There's, that's
business.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's a lot of conflicting ideas, because the other part of this is, what do you do when you have a lot of National Guard? Do you make them put security posts, for instance, right? So there's the psychological aspect on the community there, that whether you cross this checkpoint, are you going to be stopped? Yes, you belong there. Yes, you are part of this community. They don't know this. So inevitably you are stopped, inevitably you are questioned. So there's a lot of dynamics going on.
And the effect on immigration itself and just the people that are coming here legally in some ways. What is the reaction there?
Well, when you come in legally, most of the time you're going to fly in, right? If you are going to cross and walk through, because a lot of these communities are permeable. I mean, we are in this Venn diagram, right? Where you have Texas, that is where the United States and Mexico collide, and there's this community that is completely different. So some people crossing in legally, which do so every day, they know. They've seen this movie before. They know the drill. So I think they'll be fine. When it comes to legal immigration, I think there's no problems there. But also there's a lot of confusion on what is legal immigration. And I know you've talked to some people about that.
Yes,
so
we wanted to play a soundbite we have of a volunteer from Grassroots Leadership. I think this was a while back, but just sort of speaks to some of the experiences that she had coming to this country, and let's go ahead and play that.
A lot of the friends that we have come due to gang violence. So once a lot of the gangsters started being deported to El Salvador, it became really unsafe to live in the cities. And so a lot of our friends have tried to either send like older teenage sons or daughters, and they risk a ton coming over here undocumented. There aren't many options to becoming a legal resident. I mean, there are a couple of options. So you marry a citizen and you can become a legal resident that way. Or there's a door that opens up legally that allows you to do that. So once you have, for example, in the case of my family, my parents were able to earn their green card through working in the fields in California. And so they had a boss who would sponsor, through field work, their green card. Then they petitioned for us, but it wasn't until 10 years later that we were able to get green cards. And during those 10 years, we were undocumented. Why did we have to wait for 10 years? That's how long the process takes. We don't know what's going on throughout those 10 years, but there's apparently a process and a queue. And so you're in that queue until your time is up. Unless you're marrying someone or there's some kind of a door that opens up, you're not likely to find a different way to get a green card. There aren't a lot of options to getting a green card.
Just an example there of a reminder that it's not just come on in and fill out some papers and you're a citizen.
And it's very interesting because she mentions there's a couple of ways to become a legal resident, citizen, you name it. And it's interesting because hearing that there are a couple of options, but most of them are terrible options. And what I mean when I say that is, yes, you can marry a citizen, but what are your other options once you're in the country? Well, one option is that you are the victim of a violent crime.
Oh,
that's one option. One option is that you are, the victim of human trafficking. That is one option. There are visas. It's a limited number of visas, and there's a backlog of about 3 years by now. Yeah. But when we talk about there are options, most of the time, being in the United States, there are not a lot of options, and the options that we have are not options that come from beautiful outcomes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Any other reaction on where you think this goes from here? Now, the money for this goes, I think, through September. I don't know what happens after that. If this is just a set amount of time.
Well, one thing that I think is interesting is that some attorneys, especially civil rights attorneys, are keeping their ears close to the ground because, we respect our National Guard very much and we value what they do. But when there is not an emergency, we can analyze what they do, right? And what they do is they are trained as military personnel. They are not trained as constitutional anything, right? Mm-hmm. So the potential is always there for danger. Right. So that's one of the reasons why talking to civil rights attorneys, I know that they are paying a lot of attention to this.
Okay. We want to transition to...
Well, I just, on the political side, I think that as long as President Trump feels like this is something that is getting him good press, he's going to try and continue the program. The one kind of fly in the ointment there is that if Democrats do take control of Congress this fall with either the House or the Senate, that could lead to some stickier budget issues in terms of whether or not Congress will continue to pay for several thousand troops.
It is a lot of money.
It is a lot of money.
It is a lot of money. All right, well, thank you very much. We're going to transition now to fund. We're talking about a lot of money, so we're going to talk about fundraising.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Let's. Paul Ryan was here. Speaker Ryan was here in Austin, if you didn't know it, for a few days last week, end of last week, and raised.
Only a certain number of people got invitations.
You didn't get an invitation?
I didn't. Well, I also didn't have a lot of money to give.
Okay, well, I didn't get an invitation. He raised
There's a correlation there.
Almost $4 million just in that swing. I think just 3 days, 3 or maybe 3.5 days.
Texas has always been an ATM for the rest of the country, especially when you have a state that is not competitive in the general elections in November. That means that Republicans and Democrats that have a lot of money can feel empowered to put their money into races where they think they can make a difference. An extra $5 to $10 million for a Republican in a statewide race doesn't really, so far we have not seen that do anything because they're already going to win by 10 to 15 or 20 points. Same thing on the Democratic side in the opposite direction. So yeah, people come in and they say, hey, this is a really tight race in another part of the country. Give me the money, and then we can make a difference there.
And what I love is the ATM comparison instead of the cash cow, because when you ask a child how does an ATM work, they have no idea.
You just
all they know is
money comes out.
Money comes out.
That's right, and it doesn't come from anywhere. It just comes from somewhere.
Poof.
But I mean, do you think? I mean, he came to Texas, obviously. I think, well, because there's money here. But also, you mentioned, you know, the fear of some of the rise in Democratic, the threat from some of that side. I think those candidates.
Also, fundraising totals. You know, when you talk about Beto O'Rourke making, he has raised. I believe he's claiming that he's outraised Ted Cruz over the last. I believe it's 8 to 12 months. And it's like 3 out of the last 4 fundraising cycles he's outraised him.
How many millions do you remember?
He said 6.7 million, but that's just
that
the
was
first
just 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have, you know, he had a disadvantage on cash on hand starting out against Ted Cruz, who had several $1 million in the bank. That gap is closing. The money gap being tight, of course, we have not necessarily seen that means the vote gap will be tight. Now, Democrats have not really outraised Republicans in several years. I believe 2002, Tony Sanchez, is that who ran for governor? He didn't really raise a whole lot of money, but he spent millions of his own money. He outspent then Lieutenant Governor, then just in for a year or so, Governor Rick Perry. Easily outspent him, I believe, in that race, and easily lost that race as well. But the fact that the money's tight, I think, is making more national people at least say, let's not forget Texas when we're trying to gin up the base. Which, Paul Ryan being in Texas, if you're not one of those people giving him money, but you're just part of the Republican base, that's something that'll get you excited and make you think about, you know, being at the polls in 2018.
And you know, it's not only the money. When you look at population changes in Texas, the demographics are a great story, because, you know, when you count the number of people moving to Texas, is where are they moving from? And the majority of people are moving from California, and we know how California votes. So it's really interesting. I know that a lot of people are getting shivers when they think about the population shifts in Texas. And we also know, especially with Never Again, we know that the kids are very energized to vote, something that we had not seen in a long time. So all these 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds are starting to express themselves with their money, and that's interesting too.
And we'll be soon at the polls.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, Representative Farenthold from Corpus Christi resigned last week. Was this expected?
His eventual leaving was expected, obviously. It seemed like this was a bit of a out of the blue. He could have done this so that Republican candidates could have run in the March primary. Instead, he waits until a month after the March primary and then all of a sudden quits. So,
do you think that was strategic?
You know, I'm not going to climb into his head. I will say that based on, because what you then have to do is you either hold, now by resigning, you can either hold a special election within the next, I believe it's 60 days, or you can just, the governor can say, okay, it's going to be on, the special election will be on the November election time. On the regular election time. Okay. So the person who wins that still only gets a year, and then
I see.
Or no, wait a minute. Yes, they only get, gosh, it's something weird. They get to hold it for just a little bit of the time, and then there's another. Anyway,
so perhaps it was strategic.
But special elections.
Confuse us all.
The Republican, it's confused. I started confused, I think. But the Republican record over the last year on special elections has not been good.
I see.
It's those special elections where you've seen states like Alabama elect the first Democratic statewide official for a couple of decades, where you see elections in other other districts where President Trump won by 20 or 30 or 40 points, either just barely winning the Republicans or losing. In Wisconsin, I believe there was one recently as well. So the record on special elections isn't great. So I can't imagine that there was a decision made to try and figure out how to do a special election. Although having the special election in November, cushions that blow.
That would be.
Or could be.
So we don't know yet if Governor Abbott's going to call for that.
I have not heard it as of walking into this room.
Okay. Well, we do know that Representative Farenthold settled this lawsuit back a few years ago.
Yep.
For
as of now, also again, as of walking in this room, he has not repaid the money, which he took out of his campaign fund. So we will see if he ends up doing that. I mean, he's resigned now. Maybe he will just resign himself to the fact that he's not going to pay that money back. We'll see.
Yeah. And what do his constituents do in the meantime? I wonder. They need. I mean, he's not working anymore, right? And that.
Yeah, I mean, they still have 2 senators that he can go to. I mean, if in terms of the structure of the government, if you are in his district and you do need help from the federal government, you can reach out to the different liaison offices for Senator Ted Cruz or Senator John Cornyn. They do have constituents offices that try to help out with serious things. So in terms of that, they can do that. For everything else, they're just going to have to wait.
You're just going to have to wait. Anything else, guys, do you want to talk about on Coffee Talk today?
Well, I am very excited that you had me here.
It's been fun. It's been a lot of fun. I love the perspective that you had.
Talking about the border and the changes. You know, the presidential election in Mexico is going to be super interesting. There's a lot of changes. I mean, when we talk about Facebook, for instance, and the election in the U.S., right?
Right.
But we don't realize that people on Facebook who are from the U.S. is a small number. And that elections in all these other countries are going to happen and are happening. And that Facebook is there too. And that all this data is there too, right? Up for grabs. So it's going to be a fascinating election in Mexico. I say stay tuned.
So be sure you come back.
Yeah.
Right around that time afterwards as
Absolutely.
well. All right. Joy, thank you so much. And Ben, as always,
Thank
we
you.
appreciate this. We thank all of you for watching Capitol Coffee Talk here on Decibel.